We're heading into the final panel. I have taken the privilege of moderating this panel because it's a question I ask myself almost every day, which is, are we ready for 2024? And I'm guessing it's a question many of you ask as well. And I'm joined by some true luminaries in the field to discuss this question. To my left is Secretary of State Cisco Aguilar from Nevada, who just won election in 2022. To his left is former Secretary of State Trey Grayson from Kentucky, also a member of CEIR's board. In the middle is Bob Bauer in the position of privilege, right in the center there, who is one of the co-chairs of the Election Official Legal Defense Network, along with Ben Ginsberg to his left. They have both served, as everyone knows, as counsel to various political campaigns for their respective parties. And at the far end, Sarah Longwell, publisher of the Bulwark. She also wears many, many other hats as a democracy strategist and runs weekly focus groups that many of us rely upon to learn about how voters are actually thinking in the state. So thank you all for joining us. It struck me as I was crafting this panel that the question, are we ready for 2024, obviously has many different layers. There's a lot of different things we could be ready or not ready for. But I want to start with one of the themes we've heard during this conference, which is that the actual state of election administration in this country, from a factual perspective, is pretty darn good, even with the challenges that we face, the resources challenges. Trey, Bob, Ben, I'll start with the three of you, because you also served on the Presidential Commission on Election Administration nearly a decade ago, which still shocks me that it's that long ago, and came up with some excellent recommendations and that I think really contributed to the professionalism of the field that we've talked about over the past couple of decades, the last decade in particular. We'll start with you and ask, and any of you can start, how do you feel about the actual state of how election administrators run elections in the United States
I got to
today?
defer to my chairman, so they get to go first.
Yeah. Bob, why don't we start with you?
I want to defer to Ben.
That'll be the only time you hear that.
I was going to defer to either of them.
Well, thanks for coming, everybody.
Yeah, it's been great seeing you all. All right.
Yeah, go ahead, Ben.
Well, look, I think that the actual state of administering the election is really, really high. Certainly over the challenges of the past two elections shows that election officials understand the problems. They adapted to many of the challenges. We had a best practices meeting for EOLDN in January. Many of you told us about the tactics and strategies you're using to deal with election deniers. Transparency is a real key. So I feel really good about the basic structure. There has to be an understanding that with 10,000 jurisdictions actually responsible for the casting and counting of votes, and since the system is run by human beings, there are going to be some flaws and mistakes, and election administrators have shown a great ability to deal with those, but it's not going to be a perfect system, and that's a challenge still.
I would probably reframe the question as, are they preparing, are election administrators preparing rather than being prepared, because we're a ways out. But certainly, I think it's fair to say that when we started out in 2013 to conduct the field hearings for the Presidential Commission on Election Administration, and we fanned out into the country, talked to election administrators, and heard from the public at public hearings, there were a number of concerns about the fragility of the system and administrative issues. As you recall, one of the signature claims was that we still had, particularly in urban areas, unacceptably long lines, and lines obviously will continue to be an issue. But there is no doubt in my mind that in the years following, and by the way, I think this was a trend line that predated the commission. It's not a result of what the commission did, but the quality of election administration in the United States has improved dramatically in my career, in my period of time in this work. And it's been extraordinarily impressive. And you see it, for example, in some of the polling data on how voters rated their experience, say, in 2022, on a whole range of measures of what the contact they had with election administration was. The poll workers, the lines, the ease of registration, and so forth. Very impressive numbers, very high numbers, and I think reflects an extremely strong election administration across the board. When I say preparing for rather than being fully prepared, we know that laws are being changed. We know that strategies, legal strategies to confront the election administration with an array of challenges, those legal strategies are continuing to evolve. And so there's going to be, along the way, hurdles, complications that administrators here know better than I do, but there's nothing to suggest that they won't pull off what they did in 2020, which was a remarkable performance. But it won't be easy, and I'll close with something that Ben and Trey and I and other commission members then and continue to believe. The scandal is the limitation on the resources that are available to them. I mean, it's absolutely outrageous that we continue to find ways, by the way, even to shut off funding that might be available, not to mention something we observed a few years ago, which was that the level of funding provided in the first instance was inadequate.
Yeah, that's been a theme we've heard consistently, Trey.
Yeah, I think from a sort of legacy of the commission preparedness, one of the legacies I think is that Ben and Bob, when they designed both the commission and how we interacted, brought in, we interacted with local officials and state officials and the public and stakeholder groups. And when it was finished, there was a desire to make sure that this report didn't gather dust, like so many reports gather dust. And so the philanthropic community stepped up to fund implementation efforts. And so travel across the country. And you can see policies were adopted. But I also think that brought the election administration community, stakeholder community closer together. There started to be more gatherings. I think back when I was in office in the Stone Age in the 2000s, there wasn't as much interaction among all levels of election officials and stakeholder groups as there is today. There was an accelerant named Donald Trump that also played a role there. But I think you can see a real pivot after the commission, and I think also on the preparedness and getting prepared. Charles Stewart was well known. We had a Charles Stewart drinking game. I don't see Charles's head here, but we had a Charles Stewart drinking game.
You said the magic word.
Yeah, so I got to grab the water. Yeah, whenever anybody cited Charles Stewart's data, either by name or just because we just do it, we had to drink on the stage. We had on the dais there was water,
Which meant we took shorter sessions and more breaks.
Right. And to be clear, when we were presenting the report to President Obama and Vice President Biden and their leadership team, the president referenced Charles Stewart's data. And Ben and I and a couple others looked at each other and were like, So we played the Charles Stewart game in the Roosevelt Room of the White House.
As you can tell, it was a really weird bunch.
Yeah.
But I think the sharing best practices, using more data, planning better, those are some important legacies that we benefit from today.
Cisco, you are now Secretary of State of Nevada. You've been there for not quite 6 months, correct?
Almost 4.
Okay, almost 4. Nevada is a swing state. It's a very narrowly divided state. It's also a very interesting state. You've got a massive county, one of the largest counties in the country with some of the highest levels of mobility in Clark County. But you also have these, I want to say little counties. They're huge counties with very few people in them, right? And there's been some recent election denialism that's occurred in some of these counties. How, and to Bob's point, I probably should have rephrased this, how confident are you that your team and working with the counties are going to be ready for what I think we can all assume is going to be unprecedented scrutiny on Nevada in 2024?
Look, we understand what role we play in this election process, and it's critical that we do a lot of planning. We meet and speak with Nevada, we have 17 counties, which is great because we have 17 clerks we get to work with. We speak with them. We have every other week, we have a Zoom meeting for an hour and a half talking about their challenges, their issues. But beyond that, we're making significant investment in our infrastructure. I've asked for $30 million from the governor and the legislature to build a VREM system, voter registration election management system, which is going to bring us up into the current stages. I like to say right now, Nevada's suffering from a huge technology deficit. And the way we're going to address this election is by investing in it. And $30 million is a huge, huge commitment to ensuring that we have some of the best elections in the country. No, Nevada does. We are very accessible. We have, universal mail ballots. We have same-day voter registration. But behind that, we need to ensure we have the systems and the infrastructure, and that the clerks in the smaller counties have that same infrastructure to be able to run the elections that they want to run. The other thing is we could have all the technology in the world, all the resources in the world, but it comes down to the human component. What are we doing to support poll workers and election workers? They're working in fear right now, and that's unacceptable. So we just had a bill pass out of the Senate unanimously among our Republicans and Democrats to make it a felony to harass or intimidate election workers and volunteers. That's the first step in telling our election workers, we have your back, I'm gonna protect you, and we're not gonna tolerate the behavior that's been here in the past. And making sure we have that human component.
That's great. Sarah, we've heard a lot over the course of the past day and a half that the state of election administration is actually pretty good. Most voters like the way they vote, where they vote. That started with some of Charles's data. Everyone drink. In the very first session. Yet there is this disconnect between what some voters perceive, maybe not only in their own jurisdictions, but elsewhere, about election administration. Can you talk a little bit about what you found from that, from your focus groups and other research that you've been doing about voters' perceptions of how elections are run?
Yeah, there's like a ton to unpack, but actually something you just said is one very important point that it took me a while to sort of grasp, which is there's always been a component with voters, and it's true across a bunch of different places, right? So people, they think that education in the country is failing, but they like their schools. They think that Congress is terrible, but they like their congressman. Yeah. And it's similar here on elections where they think that their elections are well run, but over in Philadelphia, over in Detroit, and these cities all have something in common, but in these places where other people live, Democrats control them. I don't trust them. That's where they think, that's where they think things are going wrong. And it's difficult to convince people that something somewhere else, and that's the thing about voters, right? It comes down to the fact that they feel this deeply, that the election was stolen, but they carry it pretty lightly. And I think a lot of people here in good faith are always thinking, Ben and I talk about this a lot, how do you convince people who think an election was stolen that it wasn't? And people are always thinking about like campaigns to run and information to give them. And you guys talk in good faith about transparency. The 70% of Republicans who believe that the election was stolen do not care about your transparency because somebody was up here before talking about the Venezuela stealing. Like in the focus groups, when people talk about why they think the election was stolen, and we ask it a lot, they say things like, well, when I went to sleep, Donald Trump was winning. And when I woke up, Joe Biden was winning. So how do you explain that? And if you say, well, they kept counting votes overnight, like that's not a sufficient answer for people because it's a tribal thing, right? The answer is like, well, it's Democrats and Democrats cheat. And so they don't have a series of real reasons that you can address. Maybe you could if you were having a one-on-one dinner, but that's just not how, we're not going to have that opportunity with people. And so, and I think that, look, there's been a bunch of things. This is one of those, the more things change, the more they stay the same situations where a bunch of things have happened since the 2020 election that should change voters' perceptions of elections. Like for one thing, 2022 showed that being an election denier is a bad political proposition, right? A lot of them lost in these swing states. A bunch of laws have been passed in these Republican states, let's say just take Georgia, for example, that presumably address the concerns that these guys have. So shouldn't they trust things more? Maybe, but Donald Trump may very well be the nominee in this upcoming election, and he's going to talk about elections being stolen. And as a tribal proposition, as a connection to Trump, people will reiterate that even though they're a little bit bored with that storyline, they're a little bit past it, but it's how you say, I'm on this team, is I believe this thing.
Yeah. I just saw something this weekend, posted a map of what the real election results were on the German server that Dominion was feeding data to in 2020.
Right.
And it showed Trump winning 410 electoral votes, including California. And clearly there's not this analytical, rational element. It is obviously that should be ludicrous. That should be okay. That gives me pause about anything I hear from this person. That's not happening. And I'm just constantly struck by that. That if you raised another really good point, that there was this, we would assume the political incentive structure to be to incentivize parties to win elections.
Right.
And after 2022, the election denial as a political strategy failed, but it's not correcting the attitudes. I just
Well,
as a
there's two different incentives. I mean, that's a general election incentive, and you can't get to the general if you don't win the primary. The primary election incentive is different.
Sarah,
Let's just lay out one way in which this is working right now. So take the 2024 field. If, let's say, you're Ron DeSantis and you want to make an electability argument, you gotta vote for me because this guy's losing. Well, maybe Ron DeSantis shouldn't have campaigned with Kari Lake and other election deniers, because the fact is, when 70% of the party thinks an election was stolen, you can't convince them on an electability, right? You can't make an electability argument to people who are like, but Trump did win. They just stole it from him. And you've participated in that. So these guys are all in a trap of signaling that they agree that the election was stolen, and yet they somehow have to be saying, well, Trump is bad for the party because he makes us lose. Those things don't square with the voters, do you see? So anyway, I mean, that's how it's working.
Yeah, Ben.
Well, there's another phenomenon that's going on that I think we ought to be aware of. And to me, the greatest challenge in this election is really the ongoing crisis of confidence that people feel. That 30% number, or 70% of Republicans, is a number that has not gone down appreciably since 2020. So all the good efforts that have been undertaken about fighting disinformation, we should be candid that it's not working. And you got to recalibrate, and Sarah's data is a large part of what the recalibration should be. But also, let's recognize that what the political parties do to motivate their voters, their turnout machine, is that there is now a fraud suppression industrial complex. Republicans see fraud everywhere. Democrats see suppression. I don't want to make a moral equivalency argument about that, because I think my Republican Party has been far worse about it. But there is not evidence to back up the sort of huge charges of fraud and suppression either way. We should recognize that fraud and suppression are now the turnout models used by each party. That is a message that does not improve confidence in elections. And it is now so deep in both parties that there are consultants who live by that. There are nonprofits that live by ginning it up. There is litigation filed that is counterproductive to increasing confidence in elections and doesn't materially improve either party's chances of winning an election. And there are lots of myths on which I think the parties have built these fraud suppression turnout models, and it is in a conversation that just does not help with the crisis of confidence in elections, which makes the election administrator's job so much more challenging. And when Bob says they're preparing, that's absolutely true, and you never get to the point in that atmosphere of being prepared.
Do you think there are any places, and Georgia comes to mind, where that kind of unconstructive dichotomy between fraud and suppression are being broken to some degree, where they're broken through to some degree, rather? So, for instance, the fraud narrative did not defeat Brad Raffensperger and Brian Kemp in the primaries in 2022. The suppression narrative did not carry Democrats to statewide wave in 2022 either. Is there hope? Are there some models out there? I leave this open to anybody, because it's something I'm constantly thinking about, because you're exactly right, Ben. The resilience of the stolen election myth is something that I think has actually surprised a lot of us, and there's been so much good work debunking, pre-bunking, trying to engage, and it's not moving the needle much.
Yeah, but Sarah doesn't see that.
Well, let me just say why Georgia's different. Can you think about why Georgia's different from every other state? Because the Republicans in that state, the Republican Secretary of State and the Republican governor, did not do the stolen election thing. Everywhere else they did. And look, I was talking about this Republican triangle of doom. There are three sort of factors in radicalizing Republicans, and it is this toxic and symbiotic relationship between the elected officials, the right-wing infotainment media, and the voters. And they radicalize each other. So after the election, the whole of the Republican electorate, 70% of the Republican electorate doesn't think that the election was stolen, but Trump starts saying it is. His base starts saying it is. The right-wing infotainment media gets a hold of it. The elected officials start saying it as well. And they put each other on sort of a doom loop where, because the people who don't initially think the election was stolen hear a Republican elected official say that it was a relatively normal one, and they think, oh. And even the ones who are shading it, are saying, I don't know, I think something's fishy, which is, by the way, where most voters are when they say that the election was stolen. It's more of a I just think something was off. That's the extent of it. And they get that from elected officials who said, I just don't think everything was on the up and up, and they don't specify why, and Ted Cruz does this, whatever. And that's how you get to the big chunk of the party. But you say, what's the solution? The solution is some leadership from Republicans who say, no, the election wasn't stolen. That makes a huge difference in a state.
I mean, the challenge, of course, is Kemp and Raffensperger did what they did because they are who they are, right? They did that from the very beginning. Cheney did what she did because she is who she is, and she did that from the very beginning, paid a political price for that. But generally, after, I think, fairly saying that Republicans in some states lost elections that they might have otherwise won had they not embraced election denial. And, for instance, Kemp and Raffensperger won. That isn't changing the incentive structure for Republican leadership to stand up and do the same thing that Kemp and Raffensperger did, which is, I just throw that open. It's one of the things that...
So I watched, Kentucky's got a governor's race this year.
Yeah.
We actually have an election on Tuesday for the primary. Early voting starts in 2 days. And a week ago, we had our kind of the big governor's debate, or candidate forum. And the moderator, it's Kentucky Public Television, KET, is essentially you have to go participate in this, and you have an active moderator who asks follow-up questions. So it's not like you're boring where they all get the same question and then they go down the line. And so Renee Shaw asked them about election denialism and about the 2020 election. And Kentucky's not a battleground state. We were one of the states that passed a law that made it easier to vote. People have written our stories about this. We were a blowout. Trump won by a ton, McConnell won by a ton. Not a lot of controversy in theory. The attorney general running for governor, the commissioner of agriculture running for governor, a crazy attorney running for governor, crazy suspended attorney running for governor, former UN ambassador running for governor, and the mayor of a small town running for governor, none of them would say anything beyond Joe Biden's president. They would not say he won fairly or squarely, because they're trying to figure out, I know who's going to vote next Tuesday. I know where the 70%, I know what the math is.
Yeah.
And they responded accordingly. It was a really disappointing moment, and they all know better. But they're looking at the math of the electorate, and they were all afraid.
Cisco, let me ask you about Nevada, because I think Nevada in 22 is actually an really interesting state, because Republicans lost nearly every statewide race except the governorship, where Joe Lombardo won fairly comfortably for Nevada against an incumbent Democratic governor. And I think it's also fair to say Joe Lombardo did not embrace election denial as part of his campaign, which stood in stark contrast to some of the other statewide candidates that run. Are you seeing any kind of change in attitudes across party lines on this that might yield some positive developments for the future in Nevada?
I think if you look at the legislation we're proposing and the way it's getting out and the way they're voting, I think so. I think, I have active conversations with our governor. Obviously, he wants to see us improve our system, get better at it. For him to put $30 million in his recommended budget for VREMs was a huge, huge investment in our elections process, because he sees it, he understands it, he wants the transparency of it. But I also think it comes down to the local county clerks. We have 2 major metropolitan cities, but 15 of those counties are rural areas, which this governor won. But they're in constant communication. It's my responsibility to build trust with them. And we build trust by listening, understanding how they need our help, and delivering on that help. But I think, again, we're going to have an interesting election in 24 because my opponent, who was the leader of election deniers, is now running for the US Senate. I've never seen somebody fail up so well as he has in the past. So it's fascinating to me, but again, we have to make sure our elections are secure, which they are. It's continuing to show it, to prove it, but it's also working in a bipartisan way to be able to say, this is what we're doing for our state. This is not about Republican or Democratic values. This is about ensuring Nevadans have what they want, and we're making sure that I serve my role as a regulator and making sure I'm doing the job in the best interest of Nevadans. And I think the role as a regulator and having that mindset is critical. And thankfully, I had the experience. I served as chair of the Nevada Athletic Commission, which regulates boxing and UFC. And that regulator role is so critical to the trust and the belief in the system. And sometimes you're going to have to make very hard decisions. This is my first time running for public office. But also, too, I'm going to do the job I need to do that's in the best interest of the state. And if it has consequences, I just go back to my regular life. It's not going to change my life in any way.
Yeah.
And having that freedom is great.
Bob.
And just a couple of points. One, I just want to raise the possibility, and Sarah would have the data and the better judgment to say whether this is right or wrong, but I do think that the political problems with election denialism in 2022 don't necessarily translate to the circumstances in 2024. I can imagine candidates who, check that box in 2024 and they succeed because other issues in a presidential election are just simply more important. And I think in 2022, election denialism got wrapped up in an issue environment that was unfavorable to candidates who were viewed as extreme. And that extremism tended to encompass a series of other issues, including, for example, on reproductive rights. The environment in 2024 could be different, so somebody could wind up being a 100% election denialist and not find that that issue alone is problematic for their prospects of winning. Again, depending on the state, depending on the opposition, and so forth. The other thing I wanted to just say about the suppression fraud industrial complex, Ben's always coining a phrase. It is absolutely correct that the rhetoric on both sides is very damaging to public confidence. Certainly those of us who've been in presidential campaigns know that there's a real problem with rhetoric around these kinds of issues that field people really resist. The field people in presidential campaign really resist because the fear that if you put out a dispiriting message about voting, they won't show up at the polls. So you don't want to do that. To wit, Donald Trump saying, don't vote by mail, don't vote by mail. So Trump voters said, okay, won't vote by mail. That didn't seem to be a very good strategy for Donald Trump. But I do want to say that there is a policy baseline here I just want to return to quickly. Rhetoric is one thing and it needs to be tempered. And needs to be responsible. It needs to be supportive of what election administrators are trying to do to run an election. But the policy baseline I think that we need to be concerned with is endless confusion about what the rules are, whether it's because legislatures are threatening by administration or by legislative enactment to change rules, and there are suggestions that rules are going to be changed, or the rules are changed, or the rules in implementation don't look familiar to voters, and election administrators have to scramble to explain to voters how the rules have changed, or for that matter, a litigation program on both sides that runs right through the summer into the fall. And for someone who's been involved in presidential campaigns as I was in the last time and have been in the past, typically on the other side of this gentleman here on my
always
left.
on the other side.
Always on the other side. And for the most part, I might successfully on the other side. But by no fault of the lawyers for his candidates who were all excellent. You don't want that. It is satisfying at some fundamental level. It's also very frustrating to be faced with rule changes that you think are restrictive and inappropriately restrictive and make it harder for people to vote for no good reason on the basis of claims about election security that don't have any empirical foundation. But at some point, the rules have to be set. And the rules have to be clear and understood so that administrators can do their job in communicating with the public, and so that we in the party structure can communicate with voters and tell them what they can anticipate and how they can participate successfully. So I just wanted to lay those out.
Actually, you raise a really interesting point that I want to follow up on. I know you're not used to hearing me say things like that
Never.
about the points you raised.
First.
But the point about the difference in dynamics between 2022 and 2024 and how the presidential campaign will kind of have a huge umbrella effect dynamic over all of the other, if I'm interpreting this right. And maybe, Sarah, I'll go to you on this, because let's say, depending on who, I think we can fairly assume who's likely to be the Democratic nominee, but depending on who the Republican nominee is likely to be, I'm not going to mention names. Is it really the case that that person, if they're a virulent election denier or something less, could change this dynamic to a large degree?
Yeah, of course, although I do think that Bob's point about 22 should, I'll restate it, but it's exactly correct, which is that when I talked to swing voters the whole way in all these swing states the whole time through the election, and their election denialism is not what got them defeated. It was a combination of election denialism, their stances on abortion, which in most cases happened to be extreme, because these were extreme candidates in general who were running hardcore-based strategies, tacked on to usually something else about them that was super weird. So they would be like, Blake Masters, and they would say, I want to vote for a Republican. I don't like Joe Biden, but I'm not going to vote for Blake Masters because he's crazy on abortion, he says the election was stolen, and he's a big fan of the Unabomber. You know, like it was like there were always a few things that made these guys outliers, that had them be rejected by what is about 5% of the vote, sort of these swing voters, which is who I focus on with all my work. In 2024, the overshadowing of the big personalities in the presidential and how they approach, if you have, are we not allowed to say names? Is this like?
Oh no, you can feel free to say names.
Oh, okay, great. But if it's Trump is going to continue to make just think about, because the title is what? Are we prepared? I don't think people are sufficiently prepared or alarmed about how much close we're getting to Donald Trump just being within spitting distance of the presidency again, and how catastrophic that would be.
He's leading in a most recent poll over Joe Biden at a national
The
level.
idea that Donald Trump can't be elected, like we are one Joe Biden fall plus a recession, like away from Donald Trump being the president again and like pulling us out of NATO and never ceding the presidency, because he'll say, you can just imagine it. I should get a third term. They stole the second one from me. We should not sleepwalk into this dynamic. But if Trump is the nominee, obviously he's going to make election denialism, although I do think he'll be better on the vote by mail. I do think he's going to learn his lesson and be pro vote by mail and they'll say ballot harvesting. Like they'll say, we got to do all the things that they accuse Democrats of doing this time around. And then we'll get better on some of those tactical things.
Well, we saw proof in Nevada. On election day, we had a massive snowstorm in northern Nevada. We had a torrential rain and dust storm in the south. And all these individuals waited till election day to vote. And then when they woke up and saw what was happening, they went, oh shit, we should have just used our mail ballots. And that's what ended up happening, is they drove those mail ballots to the ballot box, which then caused us to be on the national news for 5 days in a row because we were so slow in counting ballots. But the problem is 94% of those ballots were in hand in Clark County, 97% of their ballots were in hand in Washoe. And as David knows, we just didn't have the capacity to count them. And so it took us days to catch up. But again, it's because of the fact that they finally woke up and realized this process actually works and is an insurance policy instead of having to physically go to the polls.
Yeah, and that was because those ballots came in on election day, as you said.
Yes.
You can't pre-process or prepare to count a ballot that you don't have in your hands. And that was a personal choice made by those voters, even though the option was to deliver them much earlier, right?
Correct.
But I'm just going to, if it's Ron DeSantis, we're going to spend all our time talking about like trans bathrooms. Where it's not going to be, like, he will not run on election denialism. There will still be candidates, like Carrie Lake will still say that her election was stolen and we'll still talk about it, but it will be a completely different environment if it's not Donald Trump talking about the election being stolen.
Well, and think about even to 2016 before we had election denialism, and it's Trump. I'm a Republican and I've not voted for Trump. I guess that makes me a never Trumper. But, I think about in 2016, all the evangelicals who were very uncomfortable with then version of Donald Trump, but the courts there's other issues. Same with Democrats. Joe Biden's, is more moderate than the Democratic base. And so when you have this binary choice, you have to decide what are you going to give in on. And I think for a lot of Republican voters right now, because they're kind of they might answer that question as Sarah points out, but there's all these other things that you care about. And it's somewhere ought to be a disqualifying line, and that's where I think Ben and I, fall. I'm not voting for him. I can't. But I have, but on the issues, it was really hard to not vote for the guy who represents the party that better fits my ideology and policy preference.
I guess so. To bring this kind of back to election administration for a second, all of this rhetoric that we're anticipating, I think we can even say might be likely at this point, heading into 2024. What's its impact on election administrators as they're preparing, a year from now for the fall of 2024? Do we anticipate record high turnout again? What would we expect the challenges they might face if there is this inflamed rhetoric about elections going to be stolen before the election, which, goes back to 2016. Donald Trump used the language rigged in early August of 2016 to kind of precede the notion that the election would be stolen, that he ultimately won. And then post-election, no matter, we had an earlier panel on this, no matter how well we fashion the laws for pre-processing ballots and everything else, it's going to take time to count ballots, particularly in states where the margins are narrow. And there's, if you have a few thousand vote margin, there's nothing you can do about the fact you're not going to know the results for a few days at best. So how does this impact the election officials from your perspective?
So, a couple things we've done. I think more states by 2024 should have the ability to pre-process. That's a good. We did reform the Electoral Count Act. So there's your backstop. And that's an important, and a lot of people in this room helped to make that a reality in a bipartisan manner. I think the open records, I worked with the county clerks in Kentucky, and the open records request is a real struggle because that was a hard one because you can't stop open records requests because that's an important element.
Do you want to just share a little more about what you mean by that? Because I know.
Yeah. So particularly last year, there was this. You have to keep election records for a certain number of months, and so there was a big push on the right. Hey, go grab these cast ballot records and other open records because they're all going to be destroyed. And so county officials got bombarded. All county and local election administrators, whatever the jurisdiction is, cities and in Maine and counties in Kentucky, got bombarded with these cut and paste open records requests from people who didn't know what they were asking for. That took, and local election administrators who didn't know what it was they were asking about. What is this thing? There's a report. What? I don't know what this report even is. And so it just took hours and hours and hours, and it was right at planning is a year-round thing. But when this is happening in September, that's the peak planning time for elections. And this could happen again because now you can weaponize. And now people, I think, understand. And there's not, you can tweak it to say no out-of-state people can request, but you can always find people in state. So that's a real issue. We still have the funding challenges that Bob said. But I also just think that we won't be hoping having an election in the middle of a pandemic. Hopefully, that'll be a positive. So I think there's a lot of positives that it happens to make 24 better from an election administrator perspective. There's been equipment upgrades and things like that, but the challenge that Sarah, and others have talked about of the people not knowing what it's like in another state or the questions that people have, the lack of trust in institutions, those are all still there. And that makes it a real challenge. And I think the last thing is we're gonna have a lot of new people around the country, and this is the first presidential they've administered.
Right. Because
of all the retirements. And hopefully, in our state, we're lucky because we have a big governor's race this year, so they get, I won't say it's practice, the gubernatorial candidates would hate me saying that, and the Secretary of State candidates would hate me saying it's practice. But the reality is it's a lower stress election, it's lower turnout. And that gives those folks, our clerks, because we have 25% new clerks this year, the ability to run an election this year with less stress. Even in a non-battleground state, you get stressed in presidential years.
So, I think Trey's earlier story about the debate among the Kentucky Republican gubernatorial candidates gives you an idea of what it's going to feel like for election administrators, which is election denialism is now the ante in Republican primaries. So there really won't be a contested primary that's not going to have election denial bipartisanism as part of it, which will put a huge amount of pressure on election officials to have to deal with that. There are a couple of things that seem to be helpful in combating that. Number one is election officials that we've talked to said that transparency really did help, that allowing election deniers in to see every phase of the process, actually engaging with the 30%, don't treat them like deplorables, actually explain the system is really important. And number two is I think there can be a much greater educational effort about the safeguards in the electoral system, sort of from soup to nuts, right? We talk a lot about risk limiting audits at the end as sort of validating elections, but actually there are really strong safeguards in registration and maintaining voter rolls and the way absentee ballots are counted and processed, in what happens on election day and the way the counting process works, and then the certification works. And so a much greater educational effort about the safeguards built into the system, especially concentrating on those who doubt the system the most, is, I think, a way for election officials to deal with that. And that seems to be one of the best practices that kind of came out of 2022 and can be adapted for 24.
And just to follow up on what Ben said, you might want to talk a little bit about what we and other organizations are trying to do to have that conversation then penetrate into leadership communities.
I was setting it up for you to talk.
You were setting up for me to talk.
It was a rare act of graciousness.
This is bipartisanship. It is absolutely most sterling. It's astounding. In any event, a number of organizations, and we've set one up recently, which we call Pillars of the Community, are trying to go with this message to leadership of communities, business, labor, faith, education, and engage them with election officials so that when all is said and done and there's a fight at the end about how fair was the election, what should we be expecting from election administrators in this election, they're not only being defended by partisans. Democrats will defend the Democratic Secretary of State, Republicans will defend the Republican Secretary of State, but people in the community who are trusted in these various leadership sectors, who are not trusted because they're partisans, they're trusted because they lead in business and in the ministry, whatever, they're able to say, look, we trust our local election administrators. I've met with Joe, I've met with Sally, I've met with people, I understand the system, I've been exposed to transparency here, and I'm saying these attacks are unfounded. This system is well governed, it's well set up, it's run by decent people who are working according to the highest professional standards. And so we've been to several cities, we'll be going and expanding the program to more, and as I said, there are allied organizations with which we are partnering to try to get these leadership in the communities to engage with election officials and then become advocates on their own behalf. And will it work? Will it not work? But you've got to get it, in our view, and that's what we keep hearing, by the way, from business leaders, members of the bar, and whatever in these communities, is it can't be top-down, national to state. People have to hear from people that they know, who live in the communities that they live in, who are leaders in the state that they're citizens of. Can I just mention one other thing on a more dystopian note?
Go as dystopian as you like.
Pardon me?
Is this going to be about a Terminator coming back from the future?
No. Okay. But I just want to say, I wanted to mention one thing which goes to how we see the suppression fraud. And I know Ben was saying it's not an equivalent situation. Totally agree with him, obviously, about that. But there is a piece of this right now that is outside the hands of election officials. And that is, and we see continued reporting on this, if the rules are legislatively changed on a continuing basis, if legislatures keep on changing the rules, there's a lot of press to it, there's a lot of pressure for it. We see there's ongoing, very organized money being devoted to try to persuade legislatures to move rules in a more restrictive direction in a variety of ways. That landscape having been changed is going to be the basis for, frankly, people in my wing of the world, right, Democrats and progressives, to raise questions about the legitimacy of the outcome. It'll have nothing to do with how the election was run. It'll have to do with the fact that an attempt was made, and by the way, some of the rationale comes right out of the mouth of the sponsors, to change the rules to affect a partisan outcome. And if you have, as we recently heard, a very experienced conservative activist said, look, we're talking about 4 states, and an election that will be decided in 4 states by 100,000 votes roughly. And we come out on the other side and Donald Trump has been elected. The whole question of how that happened, right? How it was that he came away with a victory in those 4 states by these very slim margins, is going to bring to the surface this systematic program of trying to change the rules in a restrictive direction, which is an enormous potential attack on public acceptance of the legitimacy of the outcome. So if community leaders have any role they can play right now, is to go to state legislators and say, okay, enough.
This is actually a really good point, and was getting into the next topic I wanted to discuss anyway, which was kind of the shifting sands of election procedures and laws in these states. And I know I've had these conversations with many of you over the years that even good changes come at a cost. Voters don't think about elections every day like some of us nerds do. And many people are going to be voting in November of 2024 for the first time since November 2020, if not for the first time ever. And these changes have a cost, and sometimes they even accelerate in the middle of an election year like 2024. Do any of you want to kind of share your thoughts on kind of these shifting stands, particularly from the perspective of election administrators, how they are, look, election administrators are by nature rules followers. I mean, they love transparency, they love rules, but it's really hard to navigate on shifting stands right underneath your feet while you're trying to plan for an election. Maybe Cisco, you could start with that.
Yeah, I think if you look at Nevada specifically, we made major efforts after COVID to readjust the way Nevadans participate. I think we're working really hard to standardize those issues, but then we had a ballot initiative this last election cycle which addressed open primaries and ranked choice voting. And by throwing a new voting process into new systems completely confuses the voter. It's not that I have a position on ranked choice voting, but it goes to the point of you're throwing something new on top of something new, and the voter's already uneasy. They're gonna go, whoa, wait a minute, what's happening? And then it puts additional pressure on us, and it's like, my dad used to always say, pigs get fat, hogs get slaughtered. And we're reaching that point of being a hog on voting reform in Nevada. We have to take a pause, we have to engage, and we have to understand what is it that Nevadans really want. And that's why I've been pushing this $30 million investment in infrastructure, because we're making decisions not off of data of what Nevadans want or how they participate. We're making decisions about voter access and other voter policies off of anecdotal information. And I think you know this, we really have to get better at counting our ballots first, because that's what the public wants and that's what they demand. And to sit there and not do a formal audit of capacity and understanding a simple process to say, Nevada's gonna have X number of ballots in this county. Each person can count ballots at this speed. To do that, they need X number of machines. And to house those machines, we need X amount of space. And it's a simple calculation that says this is X. Then you take an investment number and you say, this is the money we need. And those are the conversations we should be having to improve efficiency and to build that voter confidence. Not coming in and saying, oh, we have a new policy idea, let's talk about it. And it all just comes into a blender and the voter goes, what the heck is happening?
Yeah. And then to follow up on the point Bob was making earlier, the degree to which post-election, the losing side might cherry pick changes that were made since the last election to complain about the outcome, right? I mean, this is something that we're seeing this constantly. There's tons of examples of this. On the other hand, you never hear about the fact that Florida joined ERIC right before 2020, and Florida had the largest Republican margin that they've ever seen in 2020. Now, is that a cause and effect relationship? Almost certainly not. But that change, because they got the outcome they wanted, that change was not cited as a problem at that time. Trey,
well, I also just think from a planning standpoint, you did a great job, and I had to drink because that was a Charles Stewart reference about allocating all the resources based upon the data. But one of the challenges we have right now is how do you trust the data when in 2020 we had a voting and election and a pandemic, and people voted differently than what they're mean? We were doing your game earlier, by the way. I just saw you in the back. I'm out of water now because we talked about. But if you're a local administrator and you're trying to look at the last presidential election, that's bad data. So then you got to go back to 2016. Well, that's 8 years ago. So think about the law changes, the cultural changes. You have the challenge of a vote by mail being tainted by President Trump, but maybe I think Sarah's right that the reality is that the pragmatists, the consultants probably went out a little bit. So how do you allocate those resources? And especially in these states that are in these hybrid models where they're not pure vote by mail or not pure election day, allocating, how many vote centers do you set up? Where do you set them up? How many people are going to vote on election day? How many people are going to vote early? That's all hard, but there's no real good data to look at it. And if you mess that up, then you've got lines, and then you get people who are mad. Another factor in all this, and this is not a complaint about what, at least in our state, we're seeing the Department of Justice is weighing in more on accessible polling places. So it's interesting for me because when I was in office and HAVA passed, we had to change a lot. We had to get rid of a lot of our traditional polling places because they weren't accessible. But now the accessibility guidelines have gotten stricter. So some of the places that you've used the last 10 years, now you can't use. So you got to find new places. We're also finding more places that don't want, like a lot of times churches would allow you to use it for free, which is the right price. But now a lot of churches are like, we don't want to deal with this. And so fewer churches are willing to be used as election day polling places, and then you're left more with government. And then you have the challenge with schools and school safety. So data, finding the places, figuring out how to allocate these resources is really, is just a real challenge. And that puts that stress on that election official because you might have a well-intended person who just has a bad plan or executes their plan poorly, and then people are out for them. And they weren't bad actors, they just made some mistakes. And I think there's less forgiveness now for those kinds of mistakes than there may have been a few years ago.
One other window on this, which to me really demonstrates the confused and even decrepit nature of the political parties, is think about the mixed message that's being sent to the voter. On the one hand, you've got the fraud suppression, gin up the base to be able to turn them out. But yet part of that is bringing court cases, the litigation strategy. That can cause great confusion for voters because the rules change at the last minute. And so I think anybody who's done turnout before will tell you, just tell me what the rules are far enough in advance and I'll go through the mobilization to turn out voters. But if it's all coming at the last minute because of the litigation strategy that's sort of an offshoot of the fraud or suppression stuff, you've got real confusion potentially with voters, which is going to diminish your turnout and place real stress on election officials.
So moving on to litigation, because I think this is a great topic to discuss. If one of the complaints from the losing side in the 2020 election was that the rules were all changed right before the election. The reality, of course, as Ben, you wrote about in the Lost Not Stolen report and others have noted, is that the rules were actually, some of them did change in summer and fall of 2020, mostly due to COVID, and they were pretty well litigated. And the rules were set. COVID was, of course, a unique circumstance. Are you expecting that litigation is going to reach close to 2020 levels and cause this level of confusion for election officials and voters?
Oh, that's all you.
It's all me?
Yeah.
Oh. I mean, I think there are no reasons to think that the steady, increased, intensified litigation activity is going to abate over this election cycle. I think we may see more of a mix, which is to say we're already seeing on the Republican anti-fraud side a little more organized litigation activity adopting different strategies. And there are different groups now that have sprung up to do it. And so whereas in the past it's been thought, well, that was primarily progressive/democratic groups looking to loosen restrictions, I think we might see it go the other way now, or at least be, as I said, more of a mix. But it's hard for me to see that we're going to suddenly see a sharp leveling off or a decline, because there's nothing in recent presidential campaign history to suggest that's the case. And of course, in a very polarized environment, with each side declaring that the outcome is for them existential, all the weaponry that is potentially available will be used. And of course, lawyers get involved. Lawsuits are filed, right? So I would think there's some reason to believe that, yes, it'll continue at a significant.
And there's more of them. They're looking, and it's also the other thing is it's hard to write these laws in an iron-tight way that don't create.
I'm sorry, what?
It's hard to write these laws in an iron-tight way. So I'm almost arguing for litigation. I don't mean to, but like, there's an opportunity to make a case to clarify some things that just are just not clear. And so you have lawyers who can now get funding because campaigns and others can raise the money to pay for litigation, and it's
that's true. The other thing, to be perfectly blunt, is there are varying lawyering standards, and it is not difficult for one side to find a legal team that is willing to do things that don't reflect well on the profession as a whole. I'll put it that way, right?
Yeah. That's why the sanctions are helpful.
That's where some disciplinary action,
But many of us are lawyers on this panel, and in defense of lawyers, which I don't often say, sometimes litigation is good, right?
Of course,
it can be brought diligently, as early as possible, and resolve actual vagueness, as you pointed out, Trey, in the laws, so that those laws, so that the rules can be set and that no one can complain about them.
Vagueness, but also, to be fair, on the merits, major questions of deviation from statutory intent or constitutional violations.
Yeah.
I mean, there are such cases,
Right.
and they should be brought. But you're right, all of this 11th hour and sometimes more speculative stuff, and I mean, I'm just going to rule out for a second the circus post-2020, November 2020, because that's kind of a reality TV series more than a courtroom drama. But I think there are cases on the merits, but as you point out, getting those things resolved sooner rather than later is imperative.
As a lawyer, I think I have to defend the industry, and I think there's a way we can use lawyers in a positive way.
Are you the only non-lawyer up there?
I'm not a lawyer.
Yeah, I was just going to say, there's a...
You probably have the
So you
most to
guys
say
just have
about
at
this.
it.
Sarah, you talk the rest of the time. We're done.
Look, we can use lawyers in a good way in the elections process. I've spoken to our Supreme Court Chief Justice in Nevada, is giving CLE credits to lawyers to work the polls. And why I think that's a great idea is, one, having a lawyer sitting at the polls with the volunteers and election workers gives them, I think, a sense of comfort to know that a lawyer is there. So if somebody comes in and bullying their way in and says, blah, 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 they can stand up and say, well, actually, I'm a lawyer, the law is. The others, they become an advocate of the process and the system because everybody trusts the lawyer they know. And when the lawyer says, yeah, I spent the day at the polls, the system works well. And they communicate that to their network of friends, and then that network just grows. And so I think lawyers can be used in a positive way in our election process, and also helping with the human component of need as poll workers.
And if I can put a pitch in, this is kind of one of the things the Election Official Legal Defense Network does too, where the network EOLDN has recruited hundreds, thousands of lawyers across the country, almost none of whom are election law lawyers. But they are working with election officials in trying to help them solve their problems. So they're learning this firsthand. Most of the lawyers who would get CLE credit aren't election lawyers either.
No.
Fortunately for America, there's very few of us. Yeah, I think that's a really great point. Let me ask a question about, and it was mentioned before, the turnover in election officials, the attrition we're seeing, the vacancies. We heard these on some other panels. And maybe I'll go back to you to start, Cisco. What are you seeing in Nevada, and does it cause you concern?
It does. I mean, we have 10 of our 17 county clerks are new. So this, along with me, we're all going through this for the first time.
And one of them is in Clark County.
Correct,
Yeah.
which is our largest, where 71% of Nevada voters are. Jamie, who represents Washoe County, is also new. There's about 15% of our voters there. So between us, we're all new, which in some ways, it's not a bad thing because you bring new ideas and new perspective on how to run a system. But it is, we have to be constantly in communication. We have to be constantly engaged. We have to be willing to talk to each other. And I think we've all come together as a state to say, we're gonna have 3 elections in '24. We're going to have the presidential primary in February, the regular primary in June, and then the general in November. So that's a huge burden. And then you talk about the voter rolls and the updating of voter rolls and the prohibition from changing those voter rolls 90 days before an election. We have to be very strategic about how we're going to do this, especially when it comes to universal mail ballots, to ensure we're doing what the voter expects us to be doing.
Any of the rest have any thoughts about the turnover and attrition?
I mean, I brought it up. I mean, it's like, is it 25%? We had some folks retire last year in the middle of the year, and one of the counties that had in hindsight, a bad election plan was a retired clerk who retired. New clerk inherits the plan, doesn't own the plan because didn't understand the plan as well because didn't develop the plan, and then had some real problems. But because she was her first election and she gets reelected, or she goes on the ballot in 4 years, she'll have some time to overcome it. But it is, first time's tough, and we talked about all the, the laws changing, the open records request, the pressure for all these new folks. And so there are a lot of deterrents. And people, the other thing that I just have heard more and more clerks say, people are just mean. And not even like the professional activists, just like the random person is just mean. Like people aren't saying thank you. And in our state, the clerks do other things in addition to elections, which I think helps a little bit, except for the fact that elections are swallowing up all the other duties. But at least they have that outlet. And that's common in some other states. So that's helpful. But it is a challenge the first time you're going through it. And again, we're somewhat lucky with having a lower turnout statewide election this year for them to get their feet wet, and they don't have the locals on the ballot. There's no city council races, there's no county races.
And I'm going to go to Sarah for this one. If in some of the research you've done, talking to voters and elsewhere, are there particular geographic areas of the country, states, where you're particularly concerned that some attitudes are so entrenched and there might be a propensity for even violence if the candidate that some people support doesn't win or unexpectedly loses?
Yeah, I mean, I was never worried about violence until January. In this democracy community I'm in, there's a couple of Rachels who both specialize in political violence. You may know them, Rachel Kleinfeld and Rachel Brown, and they're both super smart, and they were always talking about political violence, and I was always ignoring them, and just kind of being like, all right. And then January 6th happened, and I think this goes back to the question of how the election would be different if it was Trump or basically any other Republican, because I do think Trump is unique in his willingness to gin up violence on his behalf. And I think if it is him, and one of the things that's changed since sort of the first go round with Trump is now there's a bunch of mini Trumps at the state level who will be running. And look, I don't know how these primaries are going to go, but the chances of, speaking of people who like fail up, or I don't know, but like Carrie Lake's going to run for Senate, and probably nobody, I was the biggest outside spender against Carrie Lake in the last election because I thought she was the most dangerous person and she had to be defeated, and she's going to run for a new office now. She's going to run for Senate. Doug Mastriano lost by 15 points, and he may very well win the Pennsylvania primary for that Senate seat. And so you're going to have a bunch of people who ran and lost, who were big election deniers, who are going to run again, and they are now sort of proto-Trump types who are happy to do the sort of wink and nods on violence that the prior sort of generation of candidates was much more responsible about. And so I've gone from somebody who didn't worry about it too much to somebody who worries about it a great deal, just because and when you do the focus groups, there is an element. I mean, one of the things that there was this time I was doing one in Alaska, and they at the end were to me, when we were sort of stopping and saying our goodbyes, they were like, well, you believe the election was stolen, right? Or you're not one of those rhinos. And through the whole group, there had been, and I remember feeling like the tables turning on me, but they had been very, that was Antifa who stormed the Capitol to make us look bad, but also, it wasn't Republicans who did that because they would have brought their guns. And you can feel, this is the thing that Trump did that people don't quite talk about enough. They talk about political violence, but they don't talk about, and this goes for the election officials, just the shadow of menace that hangs over things, that Trump is there. Other politicians are there to tamp that down. Most people because they're not like evil to their core. We'll try to tamp that down. Trump will turn that up wherever he thinks it's available. And so if it is Trump, I would worry about it a great deal, and I would be very worried for these election administrators to feel that sense of menace that will hang over everything.
Can I ask a question? When you're talking about a very specific primary setting, when those candidates win their primaries and get to the general, and you talk about a general election and winning those independents or nonpartisan, where does chaos versus pragmatism come into play?
So right now, here's the thing about the Republican Party that's changed, right? So the populist sort of version used to be a recessive gene, and it's a dominant gene in the Republican Party now, right? It's the 70%. And I keep saying, like, Trump controls the base, but the base has gotten really big. Like, what the base, this is why Doug Mastriano can win a primary. The pragmatic voters, and this is why we talk about 70-30, because I think about that 30% all the time. That's who I'm trying to communicate with. That's who all of you, like, I don't always think that going for that 70% is particularly useful. I think it's good if you can, if they're willing to engage in things, but for the most part, you've got 30% that are much more pragmatic, and I can see it right now in the Republican primary. There are three buckets. I don't want, if I get too political, just stop me, I promise, I will just stop. But there are sort of three buckets of voters. There are always Trumpers, there are maybe Trumpers, and there are move on from Trumpers. And the move on from Trumpers, there's a diploma divide in those. They tend to be college educated. They tend to be more suburban. Right now, they tend to be DeSantis's base and people who want to move on from Trump. They don't like the political violence. They don't like the menace. The problem is that the always Trumpers thrive on it. They want the circus. They want the show. They are mad. They want to flex on somebody. And then it's the maybe Trumpers that are like, I like Trump, I'll vote for Trump, but if somebody else is the person, I'll be happy to vote for them too. But it's those always Trumpers, like, and a lot of them are new. You talk about being new to the system. They're new to politics. Like, Trump brought them into politics, or he engaged them in politics in a new way that is very whipped up and is very much like it is their political identity. And it is, they want to constantly be showing you on side, and they're not. There is like a legitimate grievance in a lot of voters around living in Erie, Pennsylvania, and all the jobs going away and everybody moving away that is sort of deeply felt, and I'm deeply sympathetic to. And then there's another part of grievance that is just, I hate these guys, and it is fun to hate these guys, and I want to show up at the Capitol. And I think that's the part that worries me, is there's like there's a show going on that people want to participate in, right? They want a place to like let out the steam about how much they hate the other side.
But in Nevada, you have the nonpartisan group growing, and you see the Republican and the Democrats shrinking. Yeah. So at what point does the nonpartisan say enough is enough, and we start to focus on what that nonpartisan voter wants?
So, well, let me ask you, are you asking, because here's the thing, that pragmatic voter who we think about all the time, that swing voter that you can bring over, is like 5 to 8% of any electorate, and you can usually get them to vote for a Democrat if the Republican's crazy. But if the question is like, are there enough independent voters for like a no labels third party situation? The answer is definitely not. Like, the partisanship is and I am, what you just said about the ranked choice, all of the ideas that people have right now to change things in these big ways, I think are all a mistake. Like, whether it is we need a no labels third party candidate, I think that is a catastrophe and nobody should support it. I think that ranked choice voting right now, or any of these big changes that the democracy reform community is really in love with, are super dangerous at a time when voting trust is low. And I think that the fact is, independent voters, people who say that they're independent, they lean hard somewhere. They are not saying, boy, give me a third choice. And there's layers in that, because of course people do not want it to be Biden and Trump. They will be sad that it is Biden or Trump. They will not vote for a third party candidate overwhelmingly.
I was just wondering how do we as election officials make sure that we're including all individuals in the process and getting that turnout that we need to get to really get a true vision of what a community or a state wants?
Are you talking about mainly in primaries?
No, just in a general election. Sorry, I'm maybe taking us off topic, but I think there's a growing community here that we're focusing on the fringes so much. But as election officials, we need to ensure that we're getting turnout to get a true representation of what the state wants. for its future.
Well, I mean, if I can, I think, so what I think, so we talk a lot about the growing number of no party or independent voters a lot of the time. And to Sarah's point, you're absolutely right about, they're not truly like free agents. They're not in the, they are strong leaners mostly. They just don't necessarily put a label of D or R on their lapel, but they are consistently pretty right or left leaning voters. I mean, we're seeing higher turnout than ever before, right? I mean, it's not that people aren't showing up and expressing their viewpoints. Go ahead, Sarah.
Yeah, and it's because it's negative polarization, right? Like, I went to Prague when I was young, and I remember it was right after like the Velvet Revolution and everything, and there was this woman there, there's the Czech Republic, and she was like an equivalent of our senator, and she said, "I knew our democracy was safe when turnout started to go down in elections." And I've never forgotten that, because I'm in a democracy reform community where people are always talking about turnout and we got to get more people engaged and more people involved. And I'm like, they're involved because they're scared and they're mad. Like, we're seeing the highest turnout ever because people want to go vote against something that they hate, not because they're engaged to go vote for something they're for. And that to me is actually sort of a great tragedy, because your independents are turning out because they are freaked out on one side or another right now. I mean, I think what we would like in our politics is for people not turn out, but for people to turn out because somebody's presenting an affirmative vision that they actually agree with. Like, that's the dream, and that is not where we are right now.
Right. Why don't we open it up to questions right now? So, oh my gosh.
I got to go.
We'll start here in the front.
Thank you. My name is Donald Sherman. I'm from an organization called Crew. I think one of the differences that we've seen from 16 to 20, and now with Trump running this time around, is I think that the election denialism and the threat of political violence is going to manifest not at the general election, which we saw in 16 and 20, but potentially in Republican primaries, especially if DeSantis is in the race and there are sort of close and contested primaries. So I'm just wondering, for anybody here, but especially the Secretary of State and for Sarah, are you concerned about the primary process on the Republican side? Concerned that there's going to be sort of a front-loading of the election denialism that we've seen in past elections earlier in the process?
Are you worried about primaries?
Absolutely, are we concerned? How do we solve it? That's a continuing discussion, right? Again, it's involving, at the state level, you really have to listen to the people on the local level. And that is continuing a true, honest dialogue with your local clerks and making sure you understand what their concerns are and listening to them and following their advice. But you can't do that until you have that trust. And so right now we are on a 17 county tour of going in a meeting with every county clerk to say, what are your concerns? What keeps you up at night? How can I help you solve those issues? But I can't go in there and dictate to them how to solve the issue or what the solution is. But yes, it's a constant conversation.
I think one thing you have to keep in mind is when you think about the Republican primary is the rules. So it's winner take all. So there's going to just be a lot more pressure on those early states. So which is a big advantage for Trump, because if he gets the most votes by one vote, he gets all the delegates. Because Republicans kind of approach this, we want to have our nominee lined up earlier so we can stop beating each other up and then go fight Democrats. I remember Robin Carnahan, who served with me, she always joked, like, we try so hard to be fair, then we have like an election that takes forever. This is the 08 primary, but it's sort of the two different approaches. And so it does change the incentives. It puts a lot more stress on those early states, because if Trump knocks out the first few states and he gets enough, you just can't catch up, and so that's the system's designed to do that.
But you can't go winner take all in a Republican primary until March 15th.
Yeah, so
the
one
Super
caveat,
Tuesday states will probably not be winner take all, number one. And number two, as a party lawyer, I can tell you that the charges of election denialism do not manifest themselves in primaries. Now, if there's ever an exception to that rule, it's going to be this time. But so far, that's not where
And Trump
people
did
are
it in
young.
Iowa, I guess, right? Didn't he accuse?
Yeah, but that was Iowa, and it was a caucus. It wasn't,
Yeah.
you know, there weren't election officials really involved in that because it was
Yeah.
a party-won
That's true.
primary. So I don't think you're going to see it in Republican primaries.
I agree with that. I think, I mean, I'm always worried when there's the always Trumpers, you know, and if they don't get their way. I mean, one of the biggest reasons I think you won't is because I think they will get their way in a lot of these primaries. I'll also say, going back to the idea of like deterrence, I do think that the January 6th prosecutions of the people who stormed the Capitol, there hasn't been much political accountability for the people who, you know, spun people up. But there's been a lot of accountability for the people who actually stormed the. And when Trump got indicted, there was a lot of fear of political violence that didn't materialize. And on all of the chats with the Proud Boys and the Oath Keepers, they were all like, "This is a trap. You know, don't get violent. It's a trap because they want to send us to jail." And that's good. It's good that people went to jail and that people are now worried about there being actual accountability for political violence. But I also don't see it on the Republican primary side. I would see it in a general election.
Yeah, I guess where I was going though is that because of the more of a winner-take-all process, it's easier for Trump to win.
Yeah.
Well, that's true. And he's the only one out talking to state parties
Yeah.
about their rules. So that's 100% true.
Yeah.
Okay, we'll go to Doki and then to Rob.
Thanks. Doki Fasine, issue 1. My question is about the term election denialism and our ongoing use of it. So as somebody who's worked in the international space for several decades, this term has always been strange to me because the person leading this movement is not just an election denier, he's an authoritarian. And there have been attacks not just on our elections, but on the free press, on our courts, on our intelligence agencies, on our Constitution writ large. So from my perspective, we have an authoritarian problem in our country, not just an election denialism problem in our country. And I also think that, you know, a lot of the Americans who are sort of signed up to election denialism, it doesn't, for them, it's like, well, it was a big lie. They believe the big lie. They don't think they're actually supporting an authoritarian movement in their country. So my question is about, do we evolve this term at this point and start kind of looking at this problem in a bigger way and start calling this what it really is and sort of teaming up with other groups that are working beyond elections? And I raise that because I think by not doing that, we put a lot of pressure on our election administrators because they are the problem. And they're not, I mean, they're being sort of pointed to as the problem by politicians and by people who support Trump. But this problem is not just about our elections. Thank you. I just wanted you to respond to that.
The point you make about how it connects up to other features of Trump's. Ben Wittes and Susan Hennessy wrote this long book about how does he look at the presidency. He has a certain vision of presidential authority. I'm not constrained by Article 2. I can do it. I mean, Article 2 allows me to do whatever I want. I can use the pardon power for political purposes and so forth. And that's true. There's his refusal to concede elections, his attack on expertise, on professional election administration, whatever. It is connected to other aspects of how he sees what it means to gain and use political power. But in those other areas, there's a lot more contestation. You know, there are other presidents who've been accused of being imperial presidents and overstepping the bounds of Article 2 authority and so forth. What is unique about election denialism, quote unquote, or Trump's refusal to concede any election that he lost, and the attack on the process and the continuing attacks on after 2020, and is currently standing with the people who attacked the Capitol and his belief that they're being unfairly treated. It's just something people can grasp. It's not a point of contestation about presidential war powers or the use of the pardon power. It's something people understand is a norm that has bound the democracy together for a very long time, and Trump is trashing it. And so in that sense, it is a very, very sharp picture or label or way of grasping what is unique about his kind of politics. And the rest of it gets more complicated. It's much more complicated to draw the other issues in. from a political dialogue point of view.
So I understand your analysis, and that all makes sense. Here's what bothers me about approaching it quite that way is, and I've really learned a lot from Sarah and her groups about this, as fervently as you hold to that belief, there is half the country that totally disagrees and believes they're the ones acting on principle. And if we start talking about authoritarianism and fascism, that just pulls us apart even more. And what the last 2 years should show is that the attempts to pull apart and to demonize the Trump supporters hasn't worked, because the amount of Trump support is as great as it ever was. If you look at the polls, he's beating Joe Biden next time. So if we're going into the demonization on principle routine, as right as it may be intellectually, it's a dangerous way to go in terms of solving what should be a problem that we all see, and this should be kind of a problem-solving exercise, not a demonization exercise.
I think it's turning and taking that as motivation as a regulator to make sure that we're continually assessing our process and systems to say, are they the best they can be? If not, what do we need to do to improve them? It's putting your head down and working and using that as motivation to run the best election as we can.
Rob.
Thanks. Rob Rock from Rhode Island, and this question is for Secretary Aguilar, and you kind of just mentioned it here. I think our biggest challenge over the next year and a half as election administrators is to separate the politics from the administration. Our job is to run a secure, smooth election. We don't care who's on the ballot. Our job is to run the election smoothly. And as you said, you've got 10 of your 17 county clerks are new. I think in Rhode Island, usually we have between a quarter and a third of our election officials are new every election cycle. We need to make sure that we put forth the trust that the election process, not politics, process is secure and safe. So what are your thoughts, and perhaps Secretary Grayson too, your thoughts about educating your new clerks, about educating the public about the process? Separate who's on the ballot and just talk about secure mail ballots, early voting, election day, whatever it is in your states. We have a big job ahead of 2024, and that is to regain the trust of the public in the process, not the politicians.
You're exactly right. Again, as a regulator, it's your job to drive the bus and drive it forward, no matter what the emotional or other discussions are. It's making sure you're following the law, you're interpreting the law that's fairly done, but it's also making sure your procedures are in place. In Nevada, to do that, it's bringing up the level of engagement and participation and transparency of the voter. Part of our $30 million VRAN system, we can order a pizza and track that pizza from the time it's ordered to the time it goes into the oven to the time it's delivered to your doorstep. Bringing that to the ballot, to be able to allow somebody to sign into a portal or use ballot tracks to get updates, to know when their ballot's being mailed from the clerk, when it arrives at the postal service, when it gets on the postal truck, it's delivered to your house. So having that opportunity to know, and then when it's returned, the reverse process all the way up to the time it's processed. So the voter knows exactly every moment, like they do a pizza, where their ballot is. It's bringing that transparency and that engagement so that person or voter can sign on and know and engage in the process as they wish. And it's very personal to them. But again, it's making sure our clerks are honest about what their needs are, trying to fulfill those needs, and then bridging the gap where they can't at the state level. That's my job, is to give them the tools to be successful in their community.
So I think one thing that there's been a lot of attention paid in the last more recently is trying to build up the local associations, the associations of local election administrators, to try to use those as just enhance them. Have more conversations, give the associations in each state the best practices from the states where the things to be working better. So I think that's pretty important. I think another one, when you have a state legislature, and I realize this isn't true in all states, but when you have a state legislature that is interested and believes in this system, and we actually have that in our state, one of the things that's been helpful is to have more conversations in public with legislators, and it's given a chance for them to ask questions of clerks, to then answer, and state officials too, to answer questions, so then they can go back, they heard something from a constituent, my constituent said X, okay, here's the answer. And then they can go back to that constituent, and then they become more educated. Because I think one of the challenges in elections from interacting with legislators is they kind of know what they know from their own experience, their own race, and they won, so it worked fairly well, right? Best candidate won. And so they don't know how it works in, let alone other states, but even just other parts of your state. And so I found that dialogue of just, they have questions, we give them answers, and then that builds that relationship and that trust. I've seen, and the other thing is everybody in your state probably knows who are the rock star local election administrators. Not necessarily from the biggest jurisdictions, but who's the one maybe from a medium or small size. Push those forward. We've got a rock star in Kentucky, and if anybody, I think this is streaming, her name is Tabitha Clements, and she's from Grant County. Grant County is a small county, and Tabitha is awesome, and she's really well liked by her people in her county, by the legislators, and she goes out and talks, and people believe her, regardless of party, when she talks about how elections work. And so I think identifying those champions is something that can be helpful, and to try to just reinforce and using those locals.
Although one of the challenges I know so many of you face is that you can do that job really well. You can convince the main audience you have, which is your voters, right? Mm-hmm. But other voters in other states who have no clue what's actually going on are going to see disinformation about your processes and delegitimize your processes and actually even threaten and attack your election officials in your jurisdiction. We were talking about Stephen Richer earlier, Ray Valenzuela's boss, who's the recorder in Maricopa County. There was just an indictment and conviction of a person who threatened him. That person lives in Texas. Stephen can run a great election, which he does. He can even persuade all of his voters as he does. But how does he deal with the voter in Texas that might be threatening him and actually, impacting how he can do his job? Well, that was a cheery thought that everyone wanted to chime in on.
Well, I think it goes back again to the DOJ when the feds ask what support they can give local election officials.
Yeah.
Is doing their job through the Department of Justice and holding those people accountable.
Yeah, they arrested the guy.
Yep. All right. And by the way, that doesn't mean that doing your job for your own voters isn't worthwhile. It is incredibly valuable for so many reasons.
And when you're in one of these 4 or 5 states, like you're a national. Those are national elections, and you become a national figure in a way. But I think what's tough about this is even in the non-battleground states, this is seeping in. Yeah. And that's and maybe that's where those folks don't have they're not used to being in the public eye like they are now. And maybe they have a little bit more agency.
Just remember, you chose to run for Secretary of State
of
Nevada.
I'm the luckiest person in the world. I get it. This is an incredible job. It's an incredible opportunity because what you're doing is saying, I'm going to give somebody the opportunity to have a voice. I ran for this position not because I was interested in politics, but because of the fact that I opened a new Catholic high school with the Innovative Work Program, 86% Latino, 10% Black. And when you talk to those students about elections and whether or not their parents voted, their answer was no, because my parents don't feel as their voice matters. I can't do the work in the education space when there are 350,000 kids in a public failing system if I don't get these parents to the polls. And the opportunity that I can make sure that they have access to the polls is going to drive my commitment and my passion to make sure that every Nevadan has that opportunity. And I think it's the luckiest and best job in the entire state. So I'm excited to do it.
God, I want to end it there. That's awesome. I will just see, just imagine that's it. We're gonna cut this in the live stream and put it at the end because it was really good.
This is a guy who got paid to go watch WWE and
yeah.
He had a cool job before.
Any last questions, Rachel? Yeah.
One thing I've been thinking about for the last couple of days that I think we haven't sort of hit on directly is this question about local media, right? And talking about building trusted community messengers and people needing to hear from folks in their communities. And I'm just curious in kind of operationalizing those strategies, where are you actually putting those voices and how are we thinking about, the extent to which folks are hearing from people who are non-national and outlets that are non-national?
So obviously that's, one of the challenges is the challenge of local media, the decline of local media, the decline of state government coverage, the decline of local government coverage. So that we can't necessarily solve, but I do think that we actually had this conversation in Kentucky recently because one of the candidates for Secretary of State has been buying Facebook ads with inaccurate claims about the Kentucky voter registration list. And so we were like, how do we combat this with the facts? And so that was one where, okay, there still are some local media voices. You are the local official, go reach out, you're the trusted voice, and tell the story. Now, maybe you don't want to correct that claim, you just talk in general about elections. But there is this power. People do get their news differently, and they're also, it's also nationalized. And so that impacts, Sarah talked about that, with other panelists have talked about this, how people feel about their national elections or the other elections is impacting local. But again, a lot of this is if you're in a smaller jurisdiction, there probably is somebody, whether it's a journalist or even just an influencer. There's a lot more of these sort of soft publications that are out there, and it could be something online, or it could be the thing that the neighbors of whatever that hits your mailbox. But you got to, I think, get out and be that that local voice. I was really proud of one of the clerks was at a Republican dinner, and somebody got up and said some wrong things, and she pulled over to the chair like, I want to talk. The chair let her get up, and she got up and corrected the record. And people trusted her because she was local, and the other person was not from there. So there are these things you can, kind of got to do it at the local level. But the local media thing is just harder because there just aren't as many outlets. The subscribers are down. The number of subscribers to, especially if you're in a Gannett community, like the Gannett's destroyed the newspapers in their communities, and they have so few subscribers now that they're just not they don't have the same level of influence, and that's just the world in which you are operating. And so you have to look for those outlets.
Yeah, I mean, whenever you listen to panels like this, and I do this too because I listen to voters, and there's a lot of bleak things, and there is the menace, but I'm always struck by people like Cisco who the optimism should be there. We should be talking about election officials. Our job, all of us who do this work, is to be talking about election officials as incredibly important parts of our civic life and building them up. And I think that we also, though, have to encourage, there is a lot of the election administrators, they didn't get into this work to be on TV. Stephen Richer, who's a great friend of mine, never combs his hair, right? That guy, he wasn't trying to be on TV all the time. He didn't want to have to get up and correct everybody. But I think all of us have to say, this is the job now. The job now is different than the job was before. The importance of this role is different than it was before. And you have to go talk to everybody. You might have to hold town halls. To explain how the election system works. It's less about local media and more about you are now in a communications role, and all of us have to help them be in a communications role. And it's not that I necessarily disagree with when you're talking about authoritarianism and how bad things are. Sure, it's bad. It's bad. Our job is to go out and tell an affirmative story and to try to help election officials be no, we're going to try to make this space better for you. And I think that people who have money to put into this, that are outside dollars, should be running campaigns about these are your local election administration officials, and they're your neighbors and they're your friends, and try to build that trust. We shouldn't not do it just because 70% of the Republican Party is going to be very focused on a tribal commitment to the election being stolen. You should focus on how do you move that 30%, and that's why what Ben and Bob were talking about in terms of this pillars idea, going into the community, convincing people who are influential in that community so that they can push back, or they are on Twitter. The media landscape's completely different, and so you have to build an army of people who know more about election administration than you ever expected or needed them to, who are all able to communicate about this.
It's using your tools and your tool set. As Secretary of State, I have 8 different divisions. I can build trust with the voter on 6 of those other divisions, corporate filings, which impacts every small business, talking about the importance of small business. It's about security regulation and making sure that people are being protected from fraud. Talking about those issues and building that trust with that community. And then when an issue comes up with elections, you come and say, oh, by the way, here's how everything works. You've already established a relationship through your office using your other tools that when you do talk about the hard issues, that relationship's already built. And that's why I have to go to every 17 county in Nevada, build those relationships now, so when we get into the hard work, we're able to have an honest conversation quickly rather than having to figure out who each other are. Bob?
Yeah, the only thing I totally agree with all of that. With what Sarah said, I think is absolutely critically important. I just want to mention, because the question came up about local media, of course, in 2020, and this is going to be a continued problem, is the whole question of the performance of the social media platforms. I don't know, that's a big topic. It could take up an entire day, but a huge problem for everybody working in this space. Problem for election officials, problem for the parties, problem for the voters, huge problem.
But that's why you have to be on social media, and you have to be out there communicating with people. Like, this is now an offense position, and we talk a lot about defense in these positions. Like, well, how are we going to defend people? How are we going to, fix? Like, you just have to be an offensive, not offensively, but go on offense as a communicator, and that's the role now.
But you have to be a strategist. You can't be reactive. If you're being reactive, you've already lost the game. You have to set the strategy.
That's right.
But this is why it's so challenging, right? This is something I've talked about with election officials all over the country, is this job used to be a pretty simple job. It was, being an election administrator was basically about following processes and just setting it up. And over the last 8 years, an election official has to do all of those things and is expected to do them perfectly in an election where 160 million people are going to be casting ballots. They also have to be communications experts. They also have to be de-escalation experts. They also have to be mental health experts. They also have to be physical security and cybersecurity experts. This job, the degree to which it has expanded, and not only in breadth but in depth in terms of the degree you have to get everything right. Because, look, no election has ever been perfect. It's impossible to get an election where 160 million people are doing something they're not used to doing at all in a matter of a few days. But the expectation is perfection. And we know that the losing side now, which is not what would happen before, but the losing side will take the slightest legitimate problem and try to make it, try to have their side perceive it as a major problem that requires perhaps millions of votes just to be thrown out. And it's one of the reasons I get so inspired by the work of election officials, because they've just taken on this additional duty. I mean, their salaries haven't gone up. No one goes into elections to be rich and famous, as Sarah pointed out.
Well, you'd be a grifter.
You're
You're going to make money in elections. You'd be like, the grifters.
And you're totally right. We got to get Stephen a comb or something. I mean, because he's a great spokesman and he should be out there. But yeah, he looks like he just woke up. God bless you, Stephen, if you're watching. All right, so we're going to wrap up now, and I want to ask one final question, which is, how confident are all of you that as of January 6th, 2025, that things will go relatively smoothly according to plan, or do you have concerns about where we might be at that point? And why don't we start with Cisco and we'll work it out one.
Right. Yes, I have concerns, but again, it takes putting the effort in now. It's like, are we running a relay? Are we running a sprint? Or are we running a marathon? We are running a marathon, but the training starts now, and it's building cohesion among the team to be able to understand what the strategy is and setting the strategy now so that when a situation does come up, we can say, stick to the plan. We're okay, we planned for this, we discussed it, we prepared for it. Instead of saying, oh shit, what are we gonna do now? Those moments can occur. We have to be extremely strategic about how we're doing it, and then it takes intense planning, and I cross my fingers that the Nevada legislature understands this and invests what they need to invest to ensure we have what we have.
Trey?
Yeah, I think, I think about all the work that will have gone into the 8 years from the 2016 concerns about security up through violence and the pandemic and everything else. And also, again, I mentioned it earlier, but the Electoral Count Act reforms create some certainty that we didn't have before. It's not to say that bad actors aren't going to act badly or look for loopholes or explanations, but I just think we're better prepared today than, or we will be better prepared, in 2024, 2025 than we were 4 years ago. And that's good because in some respects, maybe the bad actors are better prepared. But I think that we were caught off guard in the elections community, and we're going to be in a better position than we would have been otherwise.
I agree that we'll be better prepared. There'll be challenges, even some that we haven't identified today. And I do want to mention, because you mentioned January of 2025, it was no small feat for Congress to have enacted the reform of the Electoral Count Act. And that's a product of a lot of bipartisan work, so that should give us hope that some of that good work, that kind of coalition can carry over into other issues.
Ben?
I agree with all that. I think the approach to this is sort of like what you would tell a candidate who's ahead. You better run scared even if you're ahead, and be prepared for everything. So I think that's kind of where we are.
Sarah, last word.
I got nothing but concerns about. But I think, boy, I don't know. I have like a lot of different things I want to say, and I'm not sure which way to go. Because I really want to go optimistic for the last word. I've really liked listening to Cisco. I think that here's the thing, not to invoke authoritarianism, but like, what people who want to tear down the system want from us is for us to be exhausted by all of it, right? It's to wear us down and make us feel tired, and to look into 2024 and think, my God, do we have to do this again? Like, I can't do it again. And like, our job is to not get exhausted, right? Our job is to approach everything that's coming with like like there is existential risk, and also that we can do it, and we have to sort of not let ourselves get sort of weighed down by how sort of big it feels, and instead just like chip away and stay optimistic and try to bring, I'm a big believer in persuasion, and try to bring as many people to the side of the sort of the pro-democracy side of things as possible to inspire people to do their jobs well, and putting aside politics and creating trust. And so just don't get tired.
And don't be afraid to ask for help.
And I think so easy, yeah. No, that's exactly. Thank you so much for all of that. And by the way, Sarah, I'm like, you were speaking, and you were you're channeling me. I mean, exactly in the same way. The concern I have over the exhaustion that is intentional is deep, and the only solution is to just keep fighting through it. This has been a great panel. Thank you all so much for your work and for being on the panel. You guys can all step off. Go ahead and you can step off, and we'll get your mics off. And then we're going to wrap up and get you out even a little bit early. Again, thanks to all of you who came. We were just to kind of follow up on that last point. Actually, that was one of the main reasons we hosted this event. Is I go around and talk to election officials all over the country, and many of whom are in this room. By the way, many of whom, there are many election officials from many states in this room, and we couldn't fit them all on panels. And I just want to thank you all for being here and participating in all of the discussions. But what I consistently hear from you is the weariness, that it's just never ending, the onslaught of the same debunked questions over and over and over again. The public records requests, which Trey related to earlier. These additional aspects of your job that weren't there a few years ago. And the reason that we hosted this event is to tell you that we all feel that as a community, and we're all here together to help. I mean, I'm still moved by Bill Gates's very openly and courageously speaking about his challenges, and he said this himself, but he knows he's not the only one. And I know from talking to many of you that that's the case. I'm also here to tell you that I think every one of us in this room is inspired by you, that we know your job is not easy, that we know you are experiencing things we are not seeing every day, and that you're still doing your job, that you're, again, if you are 100% successful, nobody is going to know your name on Wednesday after Election Day. That's your big reward. I will also say that while I do, I do have concerns about where this might go leading into 2024. I don't think there's any way to whitewash that. There are so many of you, we talk about the attrition, who have stayed on the job, who haven't left, who've had opportunities to leave and have pushed through, who are still out there recruiting workers and poll workers and connecting with your colleagues while there is an active effort to isolate you from your colleagues. There is an active effort to make you more exhausted and more weary by forcing you to isolate, to not engage with your colleagues in your states, to not engage with people of the other party, to not engage with election officials in other states, to not engage with people whose sole purpose is to help you and make your job better. That's what they want, because that will make you more tired and make you more likely to leave. And I'm telling you, from at least our perspective, the perspective of everyone in this room, that's not going to work. We're going to keep working with you all. You're going to keep working with each other. And I'm 100% confident that the election process itself will be an incredible success in 2024, just like it was in 2022 and 2020. So with that, I just want to thank you all again for being here. Thank you for engaging with each other. We'll look for other opportunities to do this in the next 18 months. And with that, goodbye. Thanks again.